Hi, this is Paul, and I just did a 12-minute video on human sacrifice, and I tried to do a short one, and I talked fast, so you're probably not going to listen to that at 1.5 or 2x, or maybe you will. Let's do a longer one, because there was an interesting conversation in night 2 on Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson on human sacrifice, and I want to deconstruct this a little bit, because there are a lot of issues implicit within it. Now, some of the stuff, recap from the first shorter video, human sacrifice is generally a bad thing. Well, why do I say generally? Isn't it always a bad thing? Yeah, but it depends what you mean by human, and it depends what you mean by sacrifice. And so in the short video, I just used the plain sense of killing a human being in order to appease or please or negotiate with a divine being, realm, or construct. Now, there's some discrete concepts in there. Do we practice human sacrifice in other ways? And as I mentioned in the short video, yes, we do. Human sacrifice is a ritualized form, animal sacrifice is a ritualized form of human sacrifice. And you can see my sacrifice video on that, on a longer treatment of what sacrifice symbolizes and how it's enacted and how the logic, the relational logic works with respect to sacrifices. Jewish Torah observance is actually functionally replaces animal sacrifice in the history of Judaism. It's difficult dealing with these names because is it right to call Judaism before 70 AD? The practice of the Jewish people and the practice of the people of Israel. Throughout the Old Testament, you have this constant tension. You can see it in the book of Kings, which I'm preaching through in my Sunday morning series now, where there's the tension between the high places where people were basically ad hocing their spiritual practices and then temple worship at the temple in Jerusalem. And the book of Kings takes a very dim view on the high places and critiques all of the kings pretty much for not shutting down the high places. Now, what's that about? Well, there's a lot of things that go into that. And again, I talk about some of these things in my Sunday school class and in my sermons. But what happens when the temple at Jerusalem is destroyed and the Jews are exiled to Babylon and to other places is that they no longer have access to the temple in order to fulfill their sacrificial obligations according to the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And so what happens is that Torah observance, the reading, the memorization, the obedience to the Torah replaces sacrifice as the means by which the people relate to God. Now, this is very important because when you get to Christian worship, there's a lot of connections here because you read in the book of Acts that Paul basically takes synagogue life and it begins to get transformed into Christian life. Well, what about sacrifice? Well, some of the Torah observance, the reading, the prayer, the teaching by the apostles, that's similar to some of what happened in Jewish synagogue. But then now the Lord's Supper eventually takes on the form of a ritualized sacrifice within Christian worship. And so Sam Harris is very right here that Christians ritualize Jesus' sacrifice, which is a human sacrifice, in the Eucharist, communion, and Lord's Supper. Now, there's a big conversation in terms of how this is thought about in the Orthodox Church, how this is thought about in the Roman Catholic Church, becomes a big sticking point in the Protestant Reformation, and so this continues to be discussed, but you can never say no one, few people will debate that the sacrifice of Christ is ritualized. Is it memorialized? Is it a sign and a seal? That tends to be the language of the Protestants. I'm not going to frame the Roman Catholics. That would be dangerous just because I'd probably get it wrong. But anyway, short statement, yes, Jesus' sacrifice is ritualized within the church in the Eucharist, communion, Lord's Supper. But human sacrifice, what is a human being? Well, some Christians and others protest abortion, and Sam Harris brings up abortion quite a bit and doesn't like Christians' opposition to abortion because they see it as a form of secular human sacrifice. Well, how could you see that? Well, then you have the arguments, the fetus, or at what point is the fetus, or what point should the fetus be regarded as a human being, should be regarded with rights or protection. So the argument is that the fetus isn't human, But the baby is sacrificed, and now we're going to get into the use of this word. The baby is sacrificed for the perceived present or future welfare of the mother. And this is where we get into killing or death as well. So the fetus will no longer grow to have a future in birth and then a future in humanity as we would imagine. Now, in Iceland, for example, there are no more Down syndrome children, or very few Down syndrome children. Why? Because they are aborted in utero. Are people with Down syndrome human beings? Is Down syndrome such a thing that it compromises human identity to the degree that it has now become common practice in certain places to destroy the fetus because it has Down syndrome? In places like India and China, fetuses are sometimes aborted on the basis of their sex. So, human sacrifice. Are these potentially examples of human sacrifice? Well, you can argue the case, yes or no. Soldier human self-sacrifice is common. Soldiers lay down their lives for their buddies, for their families, for their countries. They lay down their lives all the time. Is that a form of human sacrifice? No, this isn't a form of ritual human sacrifice to appease a deity, but if you read Jonathan Haidt, you might say that in some ways nationalism is in fact a religion, and some of the same things operate when we travel around the flagpole and get some of that magnetism going with respect to the nation. So is nationalism tainted by human sacrifice in the same way Christianity is? Now, the President of the United States sacrifices soldiers for a national goal. Now it's no longer self-sacrifice. Enemies sacrifice soldiers of the other army for their goals. In other words, there's a lot of sacrificing humans. Now you might say, now you're playing games with this word sacrifice, and we're going to have to come to terms with this sacrifice. So we can say, well, is human sacrifice a thing that's on a spectrum? Or is the term human sacrifice only a thing that reflects a ritualized sacrifice of a human being to appease, negotiate with, impress, do something relationally towards a deity? Well, okay, how do you want to define it? I would argue this is at least worthy of conversation, because the idea of sacrifice is one that is deeply tied, especially as showed by Jordan Peterson, to ideas about the future, ideas about relationships, exchanges, one good for another. Industrial human sacrifice. When a large project is envisioned, owners and engineers expect but try to mitigate worker death. If you have a large enough project or a large enough enterprise, something like building a bridge or building a dam or building a nuclear reactor or running a nuclear reactor. In fact, these kinds of that they basically assume, or have at least in the past assumed, a certain number of people will die pursuing this project. So can we talk about human beings being sacrificed in order to achieve a secular goal? Now you might say, it's justifiable. Now again, this is where we get into, if you watch my last video about rules and justification, almost everyone will say don't kill people. That's easy. Well, is that downstream from Christianity? Well, you're going to have to talk about this genetic fallacy and on with respect to that, but don't kill people, value human life. Is that from Christianity and Genesis and the Imago Dei? Again, you can argue about that. But the question are, what are justifiable exceptions to the rule? That tends to be the place where you get all of the interesting conversation, where you get all of the disagreement. Well, I think killing is wrong, but if someone comes into my house in the middle of the night, I take out my gun and I shoot them because it's justified to protect my family. And then, of course, when the lights come on and you figure out who you shot, and the judge then looks at it and so on and so forth, the judge will decide whether it was a justifiable killing or a police, so on and so forth. So you've got the rule and you've got the justification. And again, in my short video, I weighed in on some of that in terms of motivation and necessity with respect to Christians. To what degree is the ritual involved in sacrifice important? The plain case we're talking about involves a ritual death, okay? But the ritual seems to be connected with the deity, right? Because what we find is that rituals we enact rituals in order to connect something to the sacred. But now pay attention to a military funeral. What is a military funeral? You have ceremonial burial, which we anthropologists tend to look like. If we see ceremonial burial, we say, oh, culture, humanity. Well, here's another interesting thing that I've never heard Sam Harris talk about. Maybe he has, so you can point a podcast or something to me in the future. We have been defining humanity in terms of basically religion from the beginning. That tends to be the cutoff. That's one of the cutoffs between animal life and human life. And ceremonial burial, because it's tombs we tend to find, ceremonial burial seems to be one of these deep marks of demarcation between humanity and the animal kingdom. Now, that line is very important because I think Sam Harris would agree that, let's say, Buddhists in Asia, Hindus and Buddhists are religious groups. The Abrahamic religions no longer have animal sacrifices, okay? But Hindus and Buddhists, certain areas of them continue to have animal sacrifices. For example, I saw a story of an airplane that was broken down on a runway somewhere in Asia, and everyone was working on it. And so finally, I think it was the Buddhist monks came out and sacrificed to go, and then, they were able to take off in the airplane. Mechanics also worked on it. Lived in a secular, I'm downstream from secularism too, so there we have it. But to what degree is the involvement of ritual important in the argument? Does the absence of ritual change Sam Harris's moral assessment? For example, if you regard, let's take a situation where a young mother, stressed out by all the hormonal changes that has happened, the baby is severely cramping the baby's lifestyle, and people are consistently duplicitous with things. So a mother will say, my baby is driving me crazy, and then maybe in a fit of anger harms the baby or even kills the baby. These things do happen. There's no ritual involved. Is that human sacrifice? Well, in a sense, the mother has made an exchange, the kind of freedom she enjoyed without the baby. The baby's death buys the kind of freedom the mother wants again. And you see, this is where sacrifice and all of the ways that this is connected, and that this has been connected within this, as Jordan Peterson talked about in his axioms, within this long over time watching each other mental maps that we have. Notice how easily the language lends itself to these kinds of stories. The frustrated mother is the mother is frustrated because she feels her future is being sacrificed for the welfare of the child. So the mother kills the child, and the child then becomes a sacrifice for the future freedom of the mother. See, in that story, I take away the fetus element and that entire discussion. Now, again, we would say this is wrong. Now, we might say it would be better to give the child up for adoption because then the child would not be sacrificed. Well, from what we know about adoption, there are other sacrifices involved. And again, now we're into the realm of a value hierarchy where we say the value of the child's physical welfare is above the initial wound that adoption makes. Some use that language. It's above the losses that will be had in the child's psyche as it grows up, the alienation from the mother, the not knowing the father. The mother basically makes a calculation and says it would be better for me to give up the child than to kill the child or to raise the child in a poor situation. Human life is full of these kinds of negotiations, these kinds of value judgments, these kinds of conversations. But why does the language of death, loss, and sacrifice come so much at hand in these things? Now you say, well, maybe it was built into us from the start. Maybe it was built into the language from the start. Maybe Sam Harris wants to try and get this all out of our language. Well, we're Jordan, if you're following Jordan Peterson, you know all about social engineering attempts to engineer us by engineering our language. So is the element of ritual important? Death and sacrifice. Physical death is a significant boundary. There's no more public participation in the secular realm. This both theists and atheists can agree on. There's no more pain or pleasure in the secular realm in terms of a future. Now, again, you have Sam Harris's conscious well-being argument. Now, the antinatalists, like David Benatar, drop in here and say, well, it'd be better for the child to not have been born. Well, if you start down that road, you might begin to think, well, it's better to take the life of the child in a humane way to prevent suffering. And I haven't heard Sam Harris talk on this, but I have heard other of my friends who follow Sam Harris, when there are children with pretty significant birth defects, friends of mine will say it would be better to euthanize that child. And here we use a nice euphemism to make ourselves feel better about killing. If I say we're going to kill a toddler, well, that sounds wrong. We're going to euthanize a disabled child. Now, notice what we're doing with language and how our moral mental minions, boy, Rationality rules can do something with this. That's kind of a funny meme. I shouldn't distract myself. That's my moral mental minions. I can't even talk now. I've distracted myself so thoroughly. But notice the connection between language and morality, how all this stuff is constructed. And of course, those of you who are well versed in philosophy know that there have been a good number of decades where we've been talking about the relationship between ontology and language, and epistemology and language, and morality and language. So death is a pretty significant boundary marker. Now, obviously, ongoing consciousness is something under dispute between theists and atheists. And then you can talk about quality of the afterlife. First time ever, I paused myself unintentionally. I really don't know where I paused myself. I better find out. Good news, I didn't miss much. Okay, so physical death is an important boundary. And public participation, ongoing consciousness, this obviously is a big debate. To what degree should a society in the public sphere value religious convictions about the afterlife? Now, this gets very interesting. Obviously, in a secular society, we have long prioritized the public over the religious, and this is obviously a very big area that Sam Harris would talk about. But to bring in a little bit more Jordan Peterson here, we would argue that we act as if it matters, because again, I've buried people who don't believe in God. And the family comes along, and because I'm a minister, they'll say a bunch of things about he went to Sunday school when he was a kid, so on and so forth. But I have yet to have anyone undo ceremonial burial as an atheist. And that would be significant for me if I saw that. If I saw an atheist, that would impress me in terms of the consistency of their conviction. If they would look at their friend and say, not he's in a better place, not he's with his mama, not any of these other things, but I'm sure it happens. But yet again, notice that ritual comes in. Okay, now if you're enacting ritual, what are you doing? And I think most of us don't know what we're doing when we're enacting ritual. It's something we do. And again, this gets into Jordan Peterson's first we act, and we watch each other act, and then we represent in words, and ritual is a representation of, and again, you'd get back into Jordan Peterson's axiomatic gods. I've got lots of videos. I've got lots of videos roaming around in my head. Videos beget videos. I could do videos all day long. But I could talk about this stuff all day long because I think about this stuff all day long. I do talk about this stuff all day long. I just do it inside my head. And I have a job that affords me the opportunity to talk about this stuff all day long in my head. But you've got pain and loss in human community, and I do PowerPoint so I don't get hopelessly distracted by my own thoughts. Are there things worse than death? Well, Sam Harris would say so. Sam uses conscious well-being as a metric for value with regard to death, and hence we get some of the justifications. Sam Harris, I don't know, I haven't heard him talk about Down syndrome. Sam Harris might, along with a lot of people in Iceland, say that Down syndrome in a fetus is a justification for abortion. So which I think is a very hard argument if you're going to make it from Sam Harris's case, because a lot of Down syndrome people seem pretty doggone happy, and we really have difficulty judging other people's happiness, be it in other ways besides how they look on their face, what they express, what they like. Conscious well-being justifies doctor-assisted suicide in California and Oregon and the Netherlands and Belgium. And then it gets really difficult when it becomes a third-party thing that we look at someone and say, it justifies their death. Now, for the most part, and again, as a pastor, I'm often in a situation where a medical emergency has happened and the doctors are giving their take on speculation about quality of life moving forward. Families have to make decisions about care. At what level of care? Do we put in a feeding tube? Do we administer water? Is it palliative care? These decisions are very difficult, and so I don't want to be hard on Sam, because this value of well-being and consciousness is definitely a strong value in our culture, and my estimation, rightfully so. And so I sit with families as they make these kinds of decisions, and often because I'm their pastor, they will look at me. Sometimes they will look at me to ask me to make the decision for them, which I will not do. I will help them process the decision. I will talk about them with the decision. But then after they have come to their own decision, they often look to me and ask, did I make the right decision? And I often can't tell them if they've made the right decision. Of course, I will have ideas, my own opinions about that, but I'm very reticent to share those kinds of opinions in a situation like that, because there is, in fact, a complicated moral landscape that is involved. And these questions are, in fact, very hard. But I would argue that, much to Sam Harris's chagrin, commitments and beliefs and opinions about religious matters matter in those situations. But I have also seen that whether or not a person participates in organized religion, the unorganized, implicit thoughts that they have regarding those kinds of things also matter. And in fact, I would argue, and of course, I'm running the risk of offending atheist listeners, I would argue that, in fact, the kinds of speculation we have to do with respect to the future conscious well-being of others gets frighteningly close to what I would regard as the religious layer of conversation. Now, you might say, well, I don't believe in anything after life. I don't believe in any beings that I can't attest to in the material realm, or that I find sufficient evidence to believing. But notice how quickly ritual comes in. Notice how quickly morality comes in. Notice how quickly, this is kind of like, that's my dog. My dog loves to snore. This is kind of like Jordan Peterson talking about the same circuitry we're using when I think religiously. It doesn't feel a lot different from imagining well-being and consciousness into the future. Those kinds of things, I'm not a brain scientist. I haven't done a scan in my brain. My guess is the same places would light up in my brain if I were saying, there is no God, how can I postulate conscious well-being of another person in the future? And sitting here and thinking within my religious framework about, let's say, what heaven in the age, or what life in the age to come will be like. I wouldn't be at all surprised if the same areas of my brain light up. And this is part of this is part of my longer term project underneath this, which is, and this is probably why I immediately paid attention to Jordan Peterson. I think in many ways, atheists and theists in our context are not that far from each other in terms of how they actually live. They use different words, but how the brain goes. And so on one hand, this makes me closer to atheists because I can easily understand them, but it also makes me suspect to the assertion that just taking God out of my brain will make me a different person. And now Matt Dillahunty and others will say, yeah, I didn't believe in God and I had pretty much the same moral landscape. That argument cuts both ways in this, and I think we should find the deeper layer beneath that accounts for the similarities in us. And again, I would argue the particular brand of atheism that is developed in the secular West is a consequence for theological and philosophical development in the West. And this gets us into Nietzsche, into Charles Taylor, into Weber, and into all of these other conversations. And the reason I believe that is because I don't see, you can find an American evangelical that is doing all kinds of things for the glory of God, and I can look at their neighbor who's an atheist doing all kinds of things just because they like it, and I can look at another neighbor who is kind of squishy in the middle, and they've got a whole lot more in common than they've got separate. And as a preacher, preachers are used to harping on people for this. See, you're no different from your secular neighbor. Well, the atheists kind of make the same point. So anyway, so I do PowerPoint so I don't get too distracted. There are things worse than death, and Sam Harris would argue that. So death, although a vitally important boundary marker, is not necessarily the most critical boundary marker with respect to, I would argue, human sacrifice. Now, there are many things that are not ritualized, but are they sacrificial? Christian communion is ritualized, but it is less sacrificial in many ways than aborting a Down syndrome child. It's got more ritual, less sacrifice. There's not a lot of sacrifice involved in sitting at church and then eating some bread and drinking some juice. Now, there might be a great deal of psychic things going on, but there's not a lot of material things. It's highly ritualized, but if you have to have a ritual quotient, a ritual measure, and a sacrifice measure, it's high ritual, it's very low sacrifice. Now, aborting a Down syndrome child might be zero ritual, high sacrifice. Well, high sacrifice, even if I give you the human thing, if you say a future Down syndrome baby is not considered a human being at whatever moment in gestation, that's still a high sacrifice. Because, well, especially in public secular terms, that child would have a long life and potentially a very happy one. So, again, this human sacrifice is not an easy thing to talk about. There are tiny sacrificial deaths that happen commonly in life. Now, you might say, well, this isn't a sacrifice because I'm going to limit sacrifice to an altar and a priest and a knife and a fire. Okay. If you're really going to limit the word to that, I don't know what other words you're going to use or who you're going to talk to. That's the downside of changing language. When you change language, you can say, I'm going to use totally different words in my head for everything I want to do. Okay. Well, you're going to be literally talking another language when you try to communicate with other people. Because sacrifice is, as Peterson and many of the pronoun conversations have said, words are communally negotiated. If, again, I think that my gender expression is Shirley Temple, and I introduce myself, hi, my name is Paul, and I'm Shirley Temple. Well, nobody's going to know what I'm saying. In fact, there's often times I say things in videos and you don't understand what I'm saying. Language is that way. But I'm going to assert that tiny sacrificial deaths happen all the time. Father sacrifices his family for his career. Mother sacrifices her career for her family. You can flip those two around. I'm not trying to be sexist. In fact, I wrote them the other way the first time, but I had problems that way too. Father sacrifices time with child to play video game or smoke weed. Child sacrifices future for weed and Cheetos. These are tiny sacrificial deaths. What is the relationship between a literal material death and a future death of a life? For example, the child that sacrifices his future on smoking weed and playing video games, smoking weed and Cheetos. There is, we would call rightly, a death. Now you might say, just as well with sacrifice. No, that's not death. That's a metaphorical death. Yeah, but the relationship between those two words is pretty strong, because if you walk into the my wife and I have an ongoing joke about basement dwellers. If you walk into the basement dweller's basement and you put a bullet through him so he's no longer wasting his life on Cheetos, well, what has died? Well, potential. Now, again, we're back at Jordan Peterson land. Potential of reading Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life and sorting himself out and getting out of the basement and finding a real woman instead of looking at porn and having real babies instead of just, whatever he's making in his computer world. And okay, but is that better? Well, what if he's having a happier time in his basement with his pot and his video games and his porn and his Cheetos? Well, now you're into the problem that Sam Harris has with respect to meaning and conscious well-being. Because again, as I've mentioned in past videos, that's a real problem in Sam Harris's scheme. Because again, we regularly exchange meaning for well-being. And this again gets right into the Jordan Peterson stuff. We are set for meaning. Meaning, in a sense, affords us a deeper, I would call it, joy than the happiness of fragging people in Call of Duty, smoking your weed, watching your porn, living in your mom's basement, eating Cheetos that she buys. Because one day she is going to die, and unless she leaves you a lot of money and the house and money to keep the electricity and the internet on, you will experience a death. So in other words, these words, sacrifice and death, we might say we want to keep them distinct to the literal definitions, but if we go down that road, then who do we sound like? And this gets us back again into the reality that Sam Harris is dealing with Christian fundamentalists. And now someone made a comment that, well, when you just use fundamentalists that way, you're not defining it. So I'll define fundamentalists, okay? When I'm using fundamentalists in this way, what happened, and again, go back over my old videos, there's a long stream of what happened with positivism in the 19th century is that as the Enlightenment progressed, we began to imagine words are like these Amazon boxes, and facts are like bricks or Amazon boxes. And what the Bible is, well, what you can do to the Bible, and many theologians did this, is they would take the Bible apart for the truth. And all of those truths could be propositional. This is exactly the same situation of Dillahunty and Harris. They're coming out of the same philosophical tradition, and the modernists and the fundamentalists were fighting and dealing with these issues together. And this is exactly why, if you listen to Dillahunty or Harris, so often they sound like Christian fundamentalists, and Christian fundamentalists are exactly in their sights. And this is exactly why creation science within Christianity took the tack that it did, because you looked at Genesis within a particular frame and you interpreted it within a particular frame and said, when I read Genesis, I find facts. So I'm going to look at Bishop Ussher's chronology. Here's a fact. God made a man out of the clay and breathed into him. That's a historical fact. Therefore, now I'm going to get myself into all kinds of trouble in the comment section in this video, because Christians from a particular side are going to rush in and say, yeah, but if you say it's just a metaphor. Now, I've been in those conversations plenty in my lifetime. And now everybody's going to say in the comment section, Paul, I want you to weigh in on this. I'm a minister in the Christian Reformed Church. Read 1973 Report 44. It was a good report. Acts of Synod 1973 Report 44. If you're really interested in what I believe, you can do your homework instead of me taking my time explaining it. And as I explain it, lots of people will not be satisfied, which is exactly the problem Jordan Peterson has when he tries to explain, do I believe in God or not? So if you really want to know, Acts of Synod, Christian Reformed Church, 1973, Report 44. I don't even think, oh, you might be able to find it on the web. Anyway, event character. There's a little clue for you. Where was I? Oh yeah, words. What does death mean? What does sacrifice mean? You mean that literally, a literal death? Okay, well, you can use that type of language, but if we ask ourselves, what is death? It is far more than literal death. And we ask ourselves, what is sacrifice? It is far more than an altar and a priest and a knife and a fire. And now again, we're back into Jordan Peterson land because we say, oh, first we act things out. Then we have this picture of the altar and the fire and the knife and the priest and the human or the animal or the grain offering or whatever it is. And again, watch my history of sacrifice video if you want to understand the symbolism beyond that. But these words have power, and you won't understand human sacrifice, the literal kind, if you don't understand all the word connections to the entire universe it's connected to. Why did the Aztecs take slaves and offer them up? You're not going to understand the event itself without the connections to the far broader world. And it's because of that that we can use language like this that says father sacrifices his family for his career. Mother sacrifices her career for her family. Father sacrifices time with his child. Is that child sacrifice? Well, not literally, thank goodness. That would be worse. Why? Because there's a value hierarchy. Father sacrifices time with child to play video games or smoke weed. Is there a certain kind of death in the child's life? Yes. Is there a certain kind of death in the father's life? Yes. So then you say, well, the father should maximize his time with his child. Oh, but even the child is within a value hierarchy because there's the relationship with the child, the relationship with the spouse, and you might say, okay, honey, I'm not going to pay any attention to you for the next 20 years while I focus on my child. Yeah. Goodbye to your marriage. And then what happens? Does that hurt your child? We put them in a hierarchy because all of this stuff is tremendously integrated. And what we do is we're constantly negotiating this hierarchy. Well, I just had a weekend away with my wife and ignored my children, so now I'm going to spend some more time with my children. And we're always negotiating these things. Are there deaths involved? Yes. Hopefully not literal. But, as we said before, there are things worse than death, which is why there's suicide, and which is why people are justifying death on all kinds of different situations. So we're into nomenclature. Should we stop using the word sacrifice in this way? Does this undermine the imagined threat of a 21st century residents of Sacramento tying up their toddlers and offering them up on their backyard barbecue? Again, as I said in my other video, we don't seem to be in any threat on any of the major world religions to literally practice child sacrifice anymore. Is the language therefore not useful? No, I think the language is very useful. Why? Because the language illuminates relationships and illuminates the normal kinds of exchanges that we make in our lives. Let's say my wife and I were going to celebrate our 30th wedding anniversary this year, and we're going to take a little trip, and it's just going to be her and I together, and we'll have sex and lots of other fun things. So there you go. Are my kids going to suffer for it? Not a whole lot. Why? That my youngest is 18 years old, and actually us going away, them watching the dog, them watching the house, it's actually a pretty good thing because it's a training wheels environment for them managing things on their own. So it's good to go away at this point. If I had a 2-year-old, would we leave the 2-year-old in the house alone while my wife and I went off on an anniversary outing? No. Why? It's a hierarchy of values. We know how to deal with this kind of thing. So because we are in no threat of people in Sacramento, California roasting toddlers on the grill to Baal or Molech, should we just get sacrifice out of the language? Number one, you're not going to do it. Number two, I would recommend that you don't, because it's a terribly useful word, because it connects our entire world and puts us in ongoing continuity and conversation with our ancestors, which is, by the way, exactly what religion is for. Now, again, you might say, well, we don't want any dogma. Well, Christians seem to find their way out of human sacrifice pretty well, as did Jews and Muslims, and apparently Hindus and Buddhists and Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and just about everybody else too, because we don't see it happening. Can we call that moral progress? Yeah. But in what ways have we just substituted? So, okay, I'm not going to kill my child, but, well, there's a wonderful story in the book of Genesis where the brothers of Joseph have to make a decision. This is where I think stories are helpful. The brothers of Joseph have to make a decision because they hate his guts and they want to kill him. And Judah says, you know, we could kill him or we could sell him. See, there's no money in killing, but there is money in selling. Now we're talking slavery. Well, what is slavery? When I thought about doing this video, I thought about maybe I should do a video on slavery. Because, and not just I know people say, well, Stefan Molyneux did a thing on slavery, or this book is good on slavery. Think of all the ways that slavery and sacrifice as words do similar things. My daughter, well, I was listening to Jordan Peterson on Joe Rogan, and Jordan Peterson talked about the 5-second rule at Netflix, and my daughter was talking about the rules that Amazon workers have, and it's like, that sounds like slavery. Well, what exactly is slavery? How, in fact, is slavery connected to sacrifice? Because you can tie these things together pretty easily. As part of this conversation, I picked up Julius Caesar's, some of the works by Julius Caesar and his Gaul campaign. And, you know, some of the things say, well, Julius Caesar came back from Gaul with 1 million slaves. Well, in the ancient world, again, you can read that wonderful book on debt, the first 5,000 years. Well, pretty much when you conquer a city, you say, look, you have a choice. Well, you don't really have a choice, but I have a choice. I can kill you now because I've already conquered your city and taken down your wall and destroyed your army, or I can make you a slave. Well, often they chose slaves. Why? Because there's some value to be found there. And as the Germans figured out, killing people on a mass scale is a very large thing. So in many ways, to let them live, or I could sacrifice them. And probably in the ancient world, there were a number of sacrifices made. Well, again, we're not going to get rid of this. We're not going to get rid of this language. It's not going to come out of our vocabulary. You can't legislate it away. Otherwise, you're in 1984. I always forget. It's 84, 85, 1984. What about feral cats? Can we sacrifice those? Well, we got certainly enough of them around. What would be the harm of sacrificing feral cats? Well, you never would in the ancient world. Again, you get into this whole symbolic world about it. Is taking it to the pound and having it euthanized and cremated a sacrifice? Well, what is a sacrifice? Well, what do we want? Well, we don't want all these feral cats running around. We don't want, all this cat feces around. We don't want cats reproduce like mad, so we don't want feral cats. So we sacrifice feral cats in order to have clean neighborhoods. Is that a proper use of the word sacrifice? No, it's ritual. Rewatch the video. These are all the issues that are involved in this conversation. Is there value in maintaining traditional word associations? If you say no, you're sort of in 1984 land. Because, well, we're not going to talk about sacrifice. We're not going to use the word that way. How will you purge it? Government mandated speech? Is this like, or not like, enforced monogamy? If you're thinking you're going to get rid of this, you're in fantasy land, and probably a worse fantasy than thinking about God. Is there reason to keep it? It is useful to is it useful to associate child sacrifice with abortion, or spending time with kids, or saving for their college education, or normal parental sacrifice? So a number of years ago, I have a friend who's one of the first people I met when I came to California, who wasn't a member of my church. He soon became a member of my church. African American man, lived down the street. I was out in front of my house with my son, who was about 6 years old at the time, and he had a son who was 5 years old at the time, and he was coaching in a youth soccer league. He pulled up his card, says, "Does your kid want to play soccer?" My kid doesn't know. He hardly knows what soccer is. I said, "Sure." And so Curtis and I became good friends, and Curtis and I have been friends since. Well, as I got to know Curtis, I got to know some of his story. He grew up in Watts in LA, and he was poor, and his mother was poor. And if you know about the percentages of what futures look like for young men who grew up in Watts when he did, the future was not bright. But his mother sacrificed. She sacrificed hard. She rode him to make sure he stayed out of trouble. Now, obviously, he was smart and worked hard in school. I don't know how hard he worked in school, but she rode him. She brought him to church, and she made sure he obeyed, and she taught him respect, and all of those values she put into him. And he was able to go to Occidental College. Now, he eventually sent his son to Occidental College, and he's been successful and wealthy enough so that he had to pay cash for his son to go to Occidental. And he told me one day, he said, I go into Occidental and I pay by check. And they say, "You don't have to pay by check. You can come here." But it's like, yeah, if I'm going to write checks this big, I want to see your face. Because, I looked at what he was paying, and it's like he was buying a nice Mercedes every year for his son to go to college there. Okay, debate the college thing, go right ahead. But here's the point. His mother sacrificed. And so when his mother died, now he works in politics, my friend does. And, oh gosh, you could probably figure out who it is now, but anyway. He works in politics. And so state senators, county officials, a number of dignitaries came to his mother's funeral, and many of them spoke. It's a black funeral, but he asked me to do the eulogy, and that was a tremendous honor to me. I was humbled and gratified by the opportunity. I had to travel to do it, and he paid my way, and I happily did it for my friend. Well, why did he? And it was a big funeral. Why did he hold such a party for his mother? Because she sacrificed. Now, you may be an atheist or you may be a theist, but this works in your head. And if your mama sacrificed to give you a future, you had better show some gratitude. Because if you don't, well, okay, listen to me talk. Where does all this come from? Is all this connected to God? Be careful how you answer that. He got a law degree, very successful career. His son played soccer with my son, lifelong friends. His son went to Occidental. His son went to graduate school. He got his son in the best programs. His son stepped out of his graduate degree into a six-figure job in another part of the country. Boom, just like that. 3 sons, all of them successful. What did his mother accomplish? She sacrificed. What did she sacrifice? She sacrificed her fun, her mental welfare, her well-being. It was her son's welfare at her expense. And so when she died, he threw her one hell of a party. And he took care of her when she was alive too. And that was his mama. And nobody was going to disrespect, was going to do anything to harm that man's mama, because when he was growing up, he didn't much like it, I'm sure, many days when she was riding him. And I've seen this story again and again. I saw it in Peterson growing up. I've seen it in Sacramento here. Mothers and sometimes fathers. Fatherhood in the black community, that's a difficult story. It's a difficult thing to talk about. But mothers sacrificing for their children. Now, what comes to mind? Well, is it just because I'm a Christian? Mothers laying their lives on the altar. Well, now I'm getting into metaphor. Yeah, that's a metaphor. She did not lay her life on a physical, literal altar. But what she did in many ways was harder. Why? Because an altar lasts for 1 minute, but 20, 30 years of back-breaking, low-pay work, coming home at night, making food for your son, keeping tabs on him, making sure he's getting grades in school, making sure he's not getting in with the wrong crowd. Boom, 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 boom. Mission accomplished. She did her job. And he will be eternally grateful. And so when I got the chance, the privilege to give that eulogy, I told that story. Sacrifice, death, happiness? No. Meaning. Boy, it's rich. I can feel it. It's joy. It's meaning. It's what life is worth. It's what every movie is about. How does the story of my friend's mother impact you? Why do we express these stories in big stories? Why do we teach them to our children? What is the good? Was the mother's sacrifice for her son rational? See, this is the problem with rational. You can construct an argument, a rational argument, and a rational argument is kind of like a tower. Or kind of like a chain. But the tower has to be standing on something, and what it's standing on are presuppositions. And some of you have noticed, Cornelius Van Til. He grew up Christian Reformed. Presuppositionalism in my tradition is pretty strong. That rationalism has to be constructed on something. And the tower is only good as the platform it's upon. Think about rationality as a chain. That chain is only as strong as the thing that it's anchored to. And what it's anchored to are the presuppositions. And this is why, again, if you go back and watch the video I made yesterday about definition of God, this is stuff that is built into us. Humans are constructed, and these roots go way, 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 way down. Now, Christians, in a sense, say they're from above, and I want to do a video on it, from above and below, because that's really deep in this whole conversation. Was the mother's sacrifice for her son rational? Was it good? Most of us would say yes, but it was sacrificial. Is the math of doing that easy? Would it have been better for that woman to have aborted my friend and never had children? Because per capita basis, abortion is, a lot of black babies get aborted. Would that have been better? Can you do that math? Well, what do you mean better? Would it have been better for her? Well, that's really hard. Would she have had more freedom? Yes. Would she have had to work as hard? Probably not. But what goods did she realize by taking on the sacrifice? Now we're into Jordan Peterson land again. Pick up that heavy cross and drag it uphill. What goods did she realize by her sacrifice? Now, my friend, when he became a father, guess what he did? He went down to Occidental and he paid that big check every year for his son. Now, would he, if you'd see the car my friend drives, he often drove these battered down cars. Why? He was paying for his son's college. Why? He was sacrificing. Okay, is that human sacrifice? He was certainly sacrificing human pleasure. He was certainly sacrificing human time. So in a sense, well, isn't death all about time? What time you have, what time you don't? So isn't time and death connected? So which is more efficient? A syllogism of moral reasoning with an admonition tacked on to the end of story? Don't do human sacrifice. But we're only going to define sacrifice and human in these narrow terms. How do you know it's good? Conscious well-being? Would the mother's conscious well-being have been better if she had aborted her son? Would my friend's conscious well-being have been better if he was more selfish and said, I'm not going to have so many babies? Or, I'm going to have lots of babies, but I'm not going to raise any of those. That happens a lot. Can you measure her suffering and compare it to the son's pleasure? Are those the right terms? Can you evaluate that? Really? Do you know enough? And now we're back to my questions about judgment and God, because we would like to imagine, and I would assert that anybody who tries to do the math imagines that the math can be done. But who could do that kind of math? Well, they would have to know everything. They would have to know everything from the consciousness level inside and the external level, because both are important. It's one thing I think Sam Harris gets right. Both are important. They would have to know things even in terms of the ancestry. And that ancestry goes, if you're a young Earth creationist, take it back 6 or 10,000 years. If you're a Darwinian, take it back 3.5 million years. You would have to be able to do all of this math in order to actually evaluate this properly. Can it be evaluated properly by a human being? No. Do we imagine that it can be evaluated properly? Do we derive emotional satisfaction that it can be evaluated properly? Does the imagination that it can be evaluated properly motivate us to at least do our less complete attempts at it? Is that built into our system? Well, this is why God is such a handy concept if you don't believe it's anything more. It's such a crucial concept that it plays a role in all of our equations all the way through. Now, I've gotten into trouble before talking about physics, which I don't know a lot about. I watch my PBS and I watch Nova and I read things that I can understand. But, when I hear about dark matter, well, why did we come up with dark matter? Why did we call it dark matter? Because we needed it to balance the equations and make the equation work. Now, this we've been doing all along, back in terms of the Aristotelian models that Galileo and Copernicus were debating. Again, read Thomas Kuhn, History of Scientific Revolutions. You got all of these models going on. Well, we can get to the model this way or we can get to the model that way. And it depends which, we can get to the answer either way. It depends which model you want to use. Well, here's the thing. Dark matter seems to help with some equations. Do we know what it is? No. Do we know that it even exists? We're not sure. All we know is that it helps make the equations work. I would argue God makes so many of our implicit equations work. This is fundamentally Peterson's argument, that God makes the equations work, and you're not going to take him out of the Jenga tower of reason without disturbing the tower. You're going to lose a lot. The thing is, you're not going to notice the loss because you're still riding the wave of your ancestors, but it's the future generations. It's the decisions you make now that are going to affect your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, your great-great-grandchildren. That's when these decisions bear their bitter or good fruit. Now, what's interesting is if you have this conception and you read the Bible, it fits perfectly into the Bible, because this is how ancient people thought. They weren't planning for themselves. They were planning for 2, 3, 4, 5 generations down the road. That's how they thought. What made them think that way? Well, life is short. What are some of the things, the really horrible things they did in thinking that way? Human sacrifice. At some point, we stopped it. Why? We stopped it because of our stories. Why? Well, I'm actually preaching on human sacrifice this week in church, or at least I mentioned it. So here it is. It's the whole ball. All right. Have I got an hour? No, less than an hour. Time to quit. I was always thinking I should say some things at the end of this, but I'm such a lazy YouTuber. So anyway, there it is.